On a cold winter morning in February, police in Rosewood respond to a 911 call reporting a suspicious death at the home of Thomas and Julia Lawson. What they discover will set off an investigation rife with twists, turns, and a shocking revelation that seems to implicate almost everyone close to the victim. This is the story of a wife's secret online affair that ended in cold-blooded murder. Thomas Lawson had always been the pillar of stability in his small-town life. In his late 40s, he had built a life defined by hard work, integrity, and loyalty. Thomas was the kind of lawyer who took his cases seriously, not because of fame or money, but because he believed in helping people. His colleagues and clients trusted him implicitly, knowing that he would never compromise on honesty. Thomas was also a family man. Though his job demanded long hours, he made sure to spend time with Julia and their two children, sharing meals and moments whenever he could. But behind his composed and polished appearance, Thomas carried a sense of unease. Lately, he had begun to notice Julia seemed distant, preoccupied with something he couldn't quite place. He brushed it off at first, but a gnawing doubt started to creep in. Julia Lawson, 42, was, on the surface, everything a community might expect of a devoted wife and mother. Quiet, thoughtful, and deeply involved in her children's lives. She devoted her days to volunteer work and local events, becoming a familiar face in Rosewood. She had met Thomas in college, falling in love with his intelligence and sense of purpose, and she had built a life with him that seemed perfect. Yet, after 2 decades, Julia felt trapped in a life that no longer brought her joy. She adored her children, but the predictable rhythm of her days left her feeling isolated and unseen. Julia yearned for something more, something to break the routine of her life. The thrill she once felt with Thomas had faded, and her days became a monotonous pattern of errands, cooking, and social events. Beneath the surface, she was quietly slipping away. In the spring of 2009, Julia found herself curious about the world outside her small town and familiar roles. She discovered online chat rooms where she could connect with strangers without the constraints of her daily life. These conversations were innocent at first, a simple exploration, she told herself. But then she met Adam Haynes, a man who was her opposite in almost every way. At 35, Adam was a fitness trainer and an aspiring musician, known more for his charisma than for steady accomplishments. He was charming but impulsive, ambitious but struggling to make ends meet. He was the kind of man who thrived on excitement, someone who chased thrill over stability. He spent his days training clients at a local gym, but his nights were devoted to music and his dreams of becoming something bigger. The two started chatting casually. Julia was drawn to Adam's energy and the unpredictability that surrounded him. a stark contrast to her carefully structured life. In those early conversations, Adam captivated her with stories of his life in the gym, his passion for music, and the struggles he faced to keep his dreams alive. He made Julia feel alive in a way she hadn't felt in years. For Adam, Julia represented the stability he didn't have. She was calm, thoughtful, and everything he felt was missing from his life. Soon, what had been a harmless connection turned into an escape for both of them. Their online exchanges grew deeper and more frequent. Julia found herself staying up late, waiting for messages from Adam, her heart racing with each notification. They shared personal stories, secrets, dreams, and fears, building an intimacy that neither could find in their everyday lives. By late summer, Julia and Adam's relationship had become a consuming part of Julia's life. She became more detached at home, finding herself daydreaming about their conversations, even when she was with her family. She began lying to Thomas and the children, creating excuses to slip away and engage in long, secret exchanges with Adam. Her life had been quiet, routine, almost invisible. Now she felt like someone truly saw her. By the fall of 2009, the thrill of their online exchanges wasn't enough. Adam suggested they meet in person. Though Julia hesitated, her longing for excitement won out. In October, she arranged to meet him at a cafe in a nearby town, away from prying eyes. That first encounter was a rush of emotions: excitement, fear, guilt, and, most of all, desire. They talked for hours, and Julia felt herself falling deeper under Adam's spell. Adam was intense, his gaze lingering on her in a way that made her feel like the center of the world. Julia hadn't felt this way in years, and she was drawn to the unpredictability and passion he offered. As their affair grew, Adam became more possessive. He began messaging Julia at all hours, pressing her to see him more frequently, even urging her to leave her family. Though Julia was thrilled by the passion, she felt uneasy with Adam's intensity. He would become frustrated whenever she mentioned her obligations at home, viewing her family as an obstacle in their relationship. At times, his words were laced with jealousy and frustration, hinting that he wanted her all to himself. Julia started feeling torn, exhilarated by her newfound sense of freedom, yet alarmed by Adam's growing demands. She feared what would happen if Thomas or anyone in Rosewood discovered the affair, and her worries mounted each day. But each time she tried to pull away, Adam would remind her of their connection, speaking of a future together, a life where she could feel alive every day. His words pulled her back, keeping her entangled in a dangerous game of love and secrecy. As the months passed, Julia's life began to unravel under the weight of the affair. By early 2010, Adam's possessiveness had grown into an obsession, and Julia found herself trapped in a relationship she couldn't easily escape. What started as a simple thrill had transformed into something dark and inescapable. Her once calm life had been shattered, and she felt like she was spiraling into something she no longer controlled. This tangled web of desire and danger was about to reach a deadly tipping point. In the early hours of February 10th, 2010, Thomas Lawson is found dead in his home office, slumped over his desk with blunt force trauma to his head. Initially, the police assume it might be a break-in gone wrong. But as they comb through the scene, things don't add up. The door shows no sign of forced entry, and nothing of value seems missing. Instead, they find one ominous detail: an unfamiliar cell phone lying near Thomas's hand. As detectives took their first steps into the investigation, the clues left behind pointed to secrets far darker than anyone in Rosewood could have imagined. Thomas Lawson's sudden death was shocking enough, but the discovery of an unfamiliar phone in his home office turned it into something sinister. It was February 12th when detectives began combing through the messages on this phone, uncovering one revelation after another that turned the investigation down a new and disturbing path. On the phone, they found a series of messages revealing Julia's hidden affair with Adam Haynes. The nature of these messages was far from innocent, filled with words that hinted at obsession and desperation. Detectives read messages where Julia seemed enchanted by Adam, words that felt intense, raw, and driven by her yearning to escape her life. As they delved deeper, phrases stood out that suggested a dangerous connection between Julia and Adam. Promises of loyalty, whispers of jealousy, and ominous declarations of what they were willing to do for each other. Detectives couldn't ignore the gravity of phrases like, "I'd do anything for you," and "I can't lose you to him." The sense of longing, secrecy, and even possessiveness in those messages painted a picture of a woman who had become swept up in a relationship beyond her control. A woman who might have felt trapped in a world of choices she couldn't take back. By February 14th, the detectives brought Julia in for questioning, hoping to understand her connection to Adam and how it might relate to Thomas's death. Sitting in the cold, sterile room, Julia seemed withdrawn, her usually calm demeanor replaced by an uncharacteristic nervousness. She was visibly tense as detectives questioned her about the phone and its incriminating messages. At first, Julia insisted the phone didn't belong to her, claiming it must have been planted. But as detectives pressed, Julia's resolve began to falter. They watched as her careful facade broke down, each question chipping away at the composure she had maintained for years. The detectives sensed a fracture in her story, a hesitation, a struggle to defend herself without revealing too much. Finally, Julia admitted to the affair, a secret she could no longer hide under scrutiny. She described Adam as a fantasy, someone who had filled the void in her life, someone she believed would never affect her reality. To Julia, Adam had been an escape, a distant, intoxicating dream she clung to in her mind. She insisted that their relationship, while intense, was not something she ever intended to bring into her real life, and certainly not something she believed could harm her husband. But the detectives sensed there was more beneath her words, an intensity that suggested her feelings for Adam went far deeper than she was willing to admit. Just as the investigation seemed focused on Julia and her affair, a twist surfaced. The detectives uncovered records revealing that Thomas, a month before his death, had hired a private investigator named Paul Harding. This revelation painted a new and complicated picture of Thomas, the dedicated family man whose life was marked by routine and loyalty, had secretly harbored suspicions about his wife. He had felt something amiss and, in his methodical way, had hired someone to quietly gather evidence. Harding had been tasked with uncovering the truth of Julia's double life, collecting evidence of her betrayal. Thomas, it seemed, was not as unaware as Julia had believed. He had intended to confront her, perhaps even end their marriage. Detectives brought Harding in for questioning. The investigator was a man accustomed to navigating secrets, but even he seemed uncomfortable with the intensity of this case. He recounted his interactions with Thomas, describing him as a man driven by disappointment rather than rage, a man whose heart had been quietly broken by suspicions he could no longer ignore. Harding insisted he was merely doing his job, claiming no involvement in the murder. But the very fact that Thomas was close to exposing Julia's betrayal added a new layer to the case. It revealed a possible motive, suggesting that Julia, desperate to protect her affair and her life with Adam, might have taken drastic steps to keep her world intact. By February 18th, the focus of the investigation turned to Adam. When detectives brought him in for questioning, Adam seemed confident at first, almost smug in his responses. He denied any involvement in Thomas's death, portraying Julia's affection as exaggerated. He claimed their connection had been a harmless escape for both of them, something that existed only in moments stolen from their ordinary lives. But as the detectives pressed further, Adam's stories started to crack. The confidence faded, replaced by glimpses of defensiveness and frustration. It became clear that Adam's feelings for Julia ran deeper than he had initially admitted. His connection to her was intense, driven by a fixation that made him feel he had a claim over her, a right that he wasn't willing to let go. Adam's alibi, which he had so confidently declared, soon unraveled under scrutiny. The detectives could see how his obsession with Julia might have fueled a desperation that could turn dangerous. The detectives sensed something darker, a possessiveness that seemed capable of violent ends. His attachment to Julia had become all-consuming, a part of his life he couldn't walk away from. On March 1st, detectives uncovered yet another damning piece of evidence. In a series of email exchanges between Julia and Adam, they found messages where Julia seemed to imply a desire to have Thomas out of the way. These exchanges had a surreal quality. Fantasies, shared in words, a dream-like projection of a life where the obstacles between them didn't exist. Julia described a future free from constraints, an idealized world where they could be together without limits. Though she claimed these words were nothing more than fleeting thoughts, never intended as a plan, the intensity of her desire cast a shadow over her innocence. Detectives saw a woman whose emotional turmoil had driven her to words that spoke of escape and freedom, words that hinted at a willingness to do whatever it took to be with the man who had captured her heart. By March 8th, the investigation revealed the most incriminating evidence yet. Police discovered that Julia had searched online for ways to solve her problems just before Thomas's death. Julia dismissed these searches as mere curiosity, claiming she had no intention of following through. But to the detectives, this search history was more than a curiosity. It was a chilling glimpse into a mind toying with the thought of erasing obstacles. This discovery transformed their view of Julia, turning her from a woman caught in a dangerous affair to someone who might have entertained the darkest of solutions to her entrapment. Each clue drew the investigators closer to the truth, painting a portrait of a woman torn between duty and desire, between the life she had built and the life she longed for. Julia's secrets, once hidden in the shadows, were now exposed, and each piece of evidence drove her deeper into a web of suspicion, forcing the detectives to question just how far. In March, the investigation had become a maze of evidence, secrets, and shifting perspectives. Detective teams working on the case were already stretched, scrutinizing every piece of evidence. Just as they believed they had gathered a clear view of what had happened, new clues surfaced, forcing them to rethink their initial conclusions. The pressure was intense, and the detectives, who had initially felt confident in their suspicion, now faced disturbing new details that unraveled everything they thought they knew. On the March 15th, an unexpected twist arrived in the form of a mysterious note left anonymously at the police station. This note was handwritten, almost hurriedly. If Thomas had intended to reveal Julia's betrayal in such a public setting, the humiliation would have been intense, not only for Julia, but for their entire family. Detectives considered the possibility that Julia might have been driven by fear. Fear of losing everything she had built, her reputation, her family, and her life in Rosewood. They knew how devastating such a public revelation would be, and it raised new questions about her motives. The idea of this public confrontation added a complex emotional layer to the case. It suggested that Thomas, despite his quiet and seemingly calm nature, had a breaking point. He may have been deeply hurt by the affair, enough to plan an explosive revelation that would shake Julia's world. This new information created a stronger potential motive for Julia. Yet the detectives couldn't ignore the lingering presence of Adam in this tangled web. Just days after this mysterious note appeared, on the March 18th, forensic analysis brought another revelation that further complicated the case. Toxicology reports showed traces of drugs in Thomas's system, suggesting that he had been sedated shortly before his death. This was a chilling discovery, one that implied premeditation rather than a spontaneous crime. Detectives began to suspect that Julia had planned to sedate Thomas to avoid an immediate confrontation, perhaps giving her enough time to think through her next move. But what made this discovery more disturbing was the fact that Julia had filled a prescription for a potent sleep aid just days before Thomas's death. This was a drug meant to induce deep sleep, used for patients with chronic insomnia. When detectives asked Julia about it, she claimed it was merely for her own use, brushing it off as something she had needed due to her restless nights. The detectives, however, couldn't ignore the timing. It was as if she had prepared to handle Thomas, to calm him or keep him unaware, without resorting to direct violence. But with the murder weapon still left at the scene, the detectives speculated that Julia's intentions might have been to avoid an explosive confrontation, not necessarily to harm him. It led them to wonder whether someone else might have taken advantage of the situation, someone like Adam. Adam's behavior and history became the focus again. The detectives knew Adam had a pattern of violent outbursts and a fixation on Julia that bordered on obsession. With each passing day, Adam's involvement seemed more likely. When the detectives confronted him again, he turned the tables, claiming that Julia had manipulated him, using her words and actions to make him believe that Thomas was a threat to their love. Adam tried to paint himself as a pawn in Julia's scheme, insisting that he would never have harmed Thomas without her subtle encouragement. Yet, the detectives were unsure if this was Adam's attempt to save himself, or if Julia truly had used her influence to push him toward an act of desperation. The investigation felt like it was at a stalemate until April 5th, when the most shocking discovery of all came to light. Unbeknownst to Julia or anyone else, Thomas had secretly installed a hidden camera in his office presumably to catch proof of Julia's betrayal. Detectives recovered the footage from a cloud storage backup, footage that had managed to capture moments from the night of the murder. Watching the footage, the investigators held their breath as they saw the figure entering the room moments before Thomas's death. It was Adam. This footage confirmed that Adam had been present in the office, positioning him squarely at the scene of the crime. With this damning evidence, detectives felt they had enough to make their move. Adam Haynes was arrested shortly afterward, the hidden camera footage cementing his role in the murder. Yet the case did not close as easily as expected. Adam continued to insist that he had been manipulated, speaking about Julia's influence over him, describing how she had turned his love into a weapon she could wield. And, in a surprising twist, Julia herself made a tearful confession. In a final attempt to control the narrative, Julia admitted to the detectives that she had, in her own way, influenced Adam. She claimed she had been trapped in a life she could no longer bear. And while she had not explicitly asked Adam to commit murder, she had known her words and actions had pushed him to it. Julia spoke of her fear of losing everything, her desperation to hold on to the thrill of her secret life, and the lengths she had gone to maintain it. She acknowledged that she had manipulated Adam, using him as her weapon without directly commanding him. She described a spiral of emotions, a descent from excitement into a fear-driven need to control her situation at any cost. Her confession was heartbreaking. A woman realizing too late the depth of the destruction she had caused. The trial became one of the most sensational events in the town's history, drawing national attention as people became captivated by the story of love, betrayal, and murder. Prosecutors argued that Julia was the mastermind, a calculating woman who had used her emotional influence to orchestrate the murder. They depicted her as a manipulative figure, using carefully placed words and suggestions to drive Adam to a point of no return. The emails, the phone messages, and Julia's own confession painted a picture of a woman who had entangled a vulnerable man into a deadly game. Adam, now portraying himself as the victim of Julia's manipulation, was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. Julia, with her quiet admission of guilt, was sentenced to 25 years for conspiracy. Her calculated decisions sealing her fate as much as Adam's actions did his. The trial's conclusion brought a sense of closure to the town of Rosewood, but the emotional scars remained. The story of Julia, Thomas, and Adam became a cautionary tale, a reminder of how secrets once revealed could devastate lives and lead to unimaginable consequences. As Julia reflects on her actions from behind bars, she realizes her quest for excitement cost her everything. The community of Rosewood is left to grapple with the shocking betrayal and tragic consequences of this twisted affair. It's sad because this is one of those cases where everything could have been avoided easily. This reminds us of another similar case we have here, where a woman's toxic relationship with her husband ends if affair and pregnancy. Make sure to check out that case.